Yeah, we haven't really got time for questions at this point. So we'll keep moving, and I'll ask the four panel members to come up for a panel discussion. So Philip, Peter, Bryan and Stephen, if you'd like to come up and take your seats. Those people who are fortunate enough to go to New York in the next year or two, well, next 20 years, and haven't visited the High Line, I can thoroughly recommend it. And if you're not on the walk this afternoon, you wanted to see something a bit similar, then go along the Goods Line, which is adjacent to where we are now. So, thank you very much indeed to our four panellists, who are Councillor Philip Thalis from the City of Sydney. Hi Philip. Peter Poulet, who's the Government Architect. Bryan Willey, Director of Better Movement and Places, Transport New South Wales. And Stephen Moore, Director Urban Design Roberts Day. So thank you very much indeed for coming along. Now the way I'm going to run this is I'm going to ask a question to two of them, and then another question to the other two of them, and then I'm going to open it up for you to ask questions. But again, to keep it moving, I'm not going to ask everyone to respond to every question that comes up. We'll maybe ask one person and move on, so that we try to cover a lot of ground. So my first question is to Peter and Stephen. So the planning legislation in New South Wales is coming into effect soon, the changes to the EP&A Act. So do you see opportunities with the new object relating to good design? Are there opportunities there that fit in with the theme of this conference, integrating various different dimensions of urban design and trying to get people active and healthy? Are there opportunities there, or is it a lost opportunity with the redesign and the implementation?
Bloody oath, there are opportunities.
Is that it? Tell us about one.
Well, the fact that we finally recognise in legislation the value and power of design. Now, design in this case is to be used for the betterment of our urban places, particularly the urban domain, but buildings as well. And so to now have it recognised by government, and hence every government agency, and I saw that list up there, needs to be cognisant of design and the integrative power of design to produce good outcomes when they do any work in our place.
Okay, good, thank you. Admirably crisp.
I'll definitely agree with that. I think particularly in terms of regulation, we've accumulated 50 years of regulation focusing on the car. And I think with the focus on creating better places, which the Government Architects Office has championed, the ability to basically reset the metrics to create the walkable places we want is the real opportunity. So we know that certain types of intersection density make walkable places. We know what all the metrics are. They're still currently illegal in most councils to build. The real opportunity is to basically reframe the agenda to create what we want.
Thank you. And then for Philip and Bryan, so again, how do we better integrate planning and transport and health as sectors, not just government, but as broad areas, planning and transport and health, here in New South Wales to get people moving more?
Thank you. That's not an easy one. Thank you very much for that question. We in government land know we can do things better. There's a number of initiatives that are underway by government. One of the initiatives that I've been involved in over the last year is the government's new transport strategy, which is in draft at the moment and soon to be released, which talks about successful places, and rolling out an approach called Movement and Place across the state, which acknowledges our streets have two functions: to move people in the broader sense, not just cars, but also acknowledges the place function. We plan to work with local government and developers to roll that out over the coming years. It will take time, but that will lead to better integration in land use as well as transport. And also we talk in government speak and future transport land about working more collaboratively across government agencies. There's been a lot of work, particularly led by the Greater Sydney Commission over the last couple of years, in looking at place-based planning, working with health and education, transport and other infrastructure agencies to be far more collaborative and look at holistic development and investment. So that's a real answer, but we're getting there.
Okay.
There's no short answer, but I think we need to really reorient the entire framework of post-war planning. It's been completely biased towards the car, both overtly and covertly, and I think it's just not good enough. So I think the FitNSW Act, its huge problem is it's never recognised public space, and it's never had any mechanism to deal with public space. So it's basically a development act, and so it misses planning because it misses the public domain. And we're still getting infrastructure projects that miss the public domain. So the Greenway is a classic case in point. I mean, really the pedestrian cycle should have been integral with the project. You could say the same thing about the Parramatta Light Rail, that for instance when it's going up to Carlingford, it really should be a project of pedestrianisation of active transport, should have more stops, should introduce new street connections to get to the new stops, should make the whole corridor uplifted through the public project. And I think we've had a loss of the making of the integrated public project, and I think that's a crisis around Australian cities. The City of Sydney is certainly trying to do what it can, but I think it's got to be across metropolitan Sydney, and the frustration of the agencies is really a roadblock, and I use that to advisedly, that we really shouldn't have.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so over to you now to ask questions either just that are relevant to you or something arising from this morning. The first question in the far corner, and then if people want to put their hands up, I'll try and take you in order. Again, try to keep them brief. If it is to sort of a particular person, please say who and please introduce yourself.
All right, I'm Wendy Oates from the Heart Foundation. I had an interesting meeting last week with someone who suggested, who kind of knows about these things, and suggested that actually what we need is a Minister for Active Transport, or at least a Parliamentary Secretary for Active Transport. So my question to some people from the panel, who may or may not like to comment on that, is do you think that would be a good thing, or is that again layering another level of complexity and another agency and more people in this decision making? Because one of the problems that we seem to have is we get new agencies set up like the Greater Sydney Commission or Future Transport or another agency who is kind of brought in to fix the problem, but then the existing agencies who kind of have the jurisdiction to actually do the work to fix the problem either aren't connecting with these new agencies, or it just makes it 10 times more complicated, and particularly for commercial interests and developers who need to navigate through all of these different agencies. So I'm just interested in your comments on what's the structure that we actually need, that we need to be lobbying for basically to get that integrated thinking happening.
Thank you.
As a government operative, I'm going to go against the trend and say we don't need more governance, we actually need action. And this is, you're talking about a cultural shift, not only in government but across community. Not everybody loves active transport. There are still people running over bike riders almost on a daily basis. So it's not only a government issue. I think it's a community-wide issue that needs to be addressed in a cultural way. Certainly by having champions for this sort of thing, for active transport, is a good thing. They don't have to be in government, they can be everywhere. 17 years it's taken, and hopefully it'll never be as bad again, because there is a cultural shift as evidenced by the sort of legislative changes that I spoke about. But really it's a cultural shift that we all need to champion, and I'd suggest the more of us that do so, the more chance we've got of getting it done sooner.
I'd echo Peter's remarks in that we don't need more governance. I don't particularly think, even though I'm a government employee, another minister is what we need. I've lived in quite a few places around the world, and Sydney's my hometown, and I see there needs to be a cultural shift. We're a very car-based society. We feel that when we get in our car, we have the right of way. I've lived in many places where that's not the attitude. The roads are to be shared, people act accordingly, and we need to get more into that mindset. So that's a slow process, but through government intervention, through community changes, through the sort of things that have been talked about this morning, that will change. But I think we've got a long way to go to disempower the car and empower other users of the road network.
We need to create the physical structure to do that, because I know what I'm like. Around my suburb, I walk in the middle of the street, and I think, when a car's coming towards me, I think, oh, they can see me, they can move around me. But when I'm in the car, I think, move out of the way, you silly bastard. When someone's walking down the street. I have this completely different mindset,
I've never called you a silly bastard.
So you need structures that make me think, no, it's shared, whether I'm a pedestrian or a motorist at the time. Now, there was who had a quick... Oh yes, thank you. And then somebody, and then you'll be next.
Jane Brendel from Council on the Ageing. I notice our conversation so far has been fairly city-centric, and I'd just like to put my hand up for rural communities, and particularly older people in rural communities, because it's the rural communities that have very high proportions of older people. And in all the discussions we've had so far, I haven't heard much about this group of people. And one of the things that we've found at Council on the Ageing is that it's really, really simple things that will get people out and about. And the one main thing is a footpath. And that is one of the main things that's missing in rural communities. It's actually missing in a lot of new developments. I live in a new development, and I don't have a footpath outside my house either. And I think it also links to the issue of isolation. And what I'd also like to see is when you're talking about walkable communities, that you're also talking about wheelable communities. With the NDIS bringing people out of their homes now, we are not seeing, I'm not hearing anything about the wider population. It all seems to be about the working population who are only doing 30% of their journeys to work out of all of the transport and journeys that go on. So I'd just like to know where in the planning of all of these things does the vision of older people and people with disability come into the frame?
Well, sorry about that. Well, how's the City of Sydney dealing with it?
There's not a particular issue in the City of Sydney. Obviously, the City of Sydney has 1 million people in the city centre per day. So it's more, our problem is more of crush and size and scale of footpaths. And the city of Sydney is actually fairly flat and very compact because it's got an old pre-car street structure. It's got small blocks, it's got lots of lanes, it's got lots of walkways. It's highly walkable, and half the trips in the City of Sydney are on foot or on bike. So it's already the case. But look, we certainly know what you mean. I'm also an architect and urban designer, and even in suburban locations, very common not to have footpaths, and that's just unacceptable. You just got to walk from driveway crossing to driveway crossing, and it's a very poor pedestrian environment.
How did we ever get there? Sorry.
Yeah, I'd certainly echo those comments, and we are trying to, plan more for both the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old, whether it's in a city or a rural place. I do think particularly in rural places and more regional locations, there's often not the appreciation of the values of walkability, and we're recently dealing with a rural council that didn't want to put in pedestrian infrastructure, and we actually had to politely remind them that they were in default of their duties under the new urban agenda, which the Australian government signed, and basic rights to pedestrian infrastructure and equality of accessibility are now things that all councils have to deliver upon.
Incredible that a council would say that these things. Just incredible. Mike here, please. Next question. Have we got one over there? Yeah, you get your go this time. Please,
I'm Joseph Bickley from the Criminal Council. I've just got a question, I guess, for the panel, maybe more directed to Bryan. Is that you mentioned that movement and place framework that Transport is developing and trying to implement. I think there's one intersection within that framework, which is high movement and high place. Is that an irreconcilable combination? Because you've got arterial roads in the Sydney area, which also are a place function. And I think there's a conflict there between making both work. But look, maybe the panel might be able to offer some discussion around that.
The simple answer is yes, there's conflict. So where there's, for those that aren't familiar with the framework, where there's high movement need and high place need, and we do have conflict. So you've got pedestrians and you've got vehicles generally that both have a need to either be in the place and enjoy the place and support the land use. And we're talking about locations like Oxford Street in Paddington or King Street in Newtown, where they are some of our best places. We really value those places in an urban context. And the answer is we need to find the best balance. And we don't think within government we've found the right balance. Probably it's been a bit weighted towards movement previously, but the introduction of movement and place, the introduction of a number of very centre-focused outcomes in the new future transport document to be released, gives us government policy that allows us to find that better balance. But we're in a we wouldn't design an environment like that now necessarily, but they are equally places that we do value in a city, and around the world, places and environments like that are valued in the urban, in a city. And it's just about finding the right balance and a safe environment. It's not necessarily the safest roads either, so it's getting that safety without putting pedestrian fencing everywhere. It's making sure the speed environment is appropriate and all users of the road understand their role in the road and share the road accordingly.
And this is probably a more personal view than a council position, but conflict's actually what you want, because what you want are places that are vibrant and busy. And of course everyone wants to go there. I'll give the example of Broadway right up the front here. Really what you want is, from a traffic point of view, is level of service F. Because it's then not working from the traffic point of view. High time, that was the norm. If you want to drive to these places like King Street, Newtown, well, you suffer the consequences. You go slow, and sometimes you can see people walk faster than you drive. Good, because the places come first, and the cars simply have to fit in. And there are lots of big city environments. I think Broadway finally is coming to life for the first time in 100 years. So they can coexist. I mean, there are great boulevards around the world. We don't have to think of them as traffic sewers. There can be urban places. They're not mutually exclusive.
And I think on that, Alan Jacobs wrote the manual on great streets and boulevards, but I think today we need to shift decision making to an evidence base which will actually achieve the goals that we want. And today you can have the evidence of a street that works perfectly well, but it statistically fails inside of a computer model, and the model is winning out over the evidence that actually exists in reality. And we need to shift our focus in how we make decision making to get the places that we want, and currently that doesn't exist.
Okay.
Yes, it's been a frustration to me over 30 years of practice that you can't, for instance, plan for a new street, a new park, because if it's in the LEP, then it has to be purchased. And the owner can trigger immediate purchase by the public authorities. Therefore, the planners and the engineers don't want to put in any public domain because they can't achieve it. We need to find a mechanism where, the first generation of urbanism with the original street layout is never going to be enough for increase in density and intensity of use. So you're going to have to, with density, increase the public domain, and we don't have a mechanism. We've got a planning act that actually thwarts you from doing it. If that's not in the changes to the act, the changes are failing again. It's not just a question of design.
I think the other real exciting opportunity is the rediscovery of strategic planning that's place focused and design focused, but it is holistic across the profession. So in Western Sydney, for example, I think you need about $600 million to build a protected bicycle network through all the city. People say we can't fund that today, but by 2026, 6,000 people will have diabetes, and for 1 year of quality adjusted life, there's going to be a rolling cost every year to taxpayers of $700 million every year in, year out. So I think we need to look more holistically at the strategic challenges and the way that the built environment can assist in preventative measures, and then how that is then filtered through into the planning legislation and the mechanisms, but also then alternate means of funding. And that's the really creative and exciting opportunity that exists in the profession at the moment.
You sure you haven't done a degree in public health? Oh, all these health people will be sort of flocking to you, paying homage, you know, people talking about evidence-based and, you know, future costing of diabetes. It's incredible.
We've been lucky enough to have the Heart Foundation at a number of contested public meetings. They've always been fantastic. I want you at every public meeting I've ever had, because you're just wonderful advocates. And we do need to think across these things. And the problem is that we think of our cities as silos of self-interest.
Yeah.
And it's not just a question for minutes for active living. It's a question of reorienting the whole discussion holistically towards cities and the urban population. Also the population of country towns.
Well, one thing is we should be outcomes driven, not policy or planning or legislation driven, and holistic in that view. Yes. So.
And again, to use the legislation to achieve your targets. So, I mean, we were working with a particular council where they wanted a fund for infrastructure, and at the moment, parking contributions under the Planning Act, you have to provide more parking, which is ridiculous. So we just simply shifted the contribution to the Local Government Act, called it a civic infrastructure fund rather than a parking fund. You could pay for parking, but also a range of other facilities, and then they could use that proactively as a lever, so that as public transport improves, the kitty of money's still coming in, but it's being redeployed now to other things. So to be creative in how we use legislation and don't make it reactive, but more proactive is the opportunity.
So just picking up on some of the words that have been thrown around, we talk about strategic planning. I don't understand the through the morning. Strategic planning, talked about design, and this phrase design-led planning that I'm not entirely comfortable with, although I'm not sure it accurately describes what the documents talk about. And then things like placemaking and community consultation. Are there conflicts? I mean, it seems to me they don't always eat. I might tick all of them I approve, but it's not obvious to me they always sit comfortably together.
I think that might be your limitation.
Another one. Oh, I can add that to my wife's list.
Is she here? No. The beauty of the phrase design-led planning is it utilises the capabilities and the tools that designers are trained in to actually improve planning outcomes. So planning has become more sophisticated by the implementation of design at its front end. So strategic planning isn't planning as we know it. It potentially uses design as a mechanism to elicit better outcomes, and that is three-dimensional, spatial, and human.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Question? No? Question from the audience? Yes, lady there, 3 rows from the back. If you want to ask a question, put a hand up and I'll put me in order. It's coming now.
I want to ask a question in regards to the RMS not being here today. I thought the basis of the conversation was about healthy and active communities. In particular, I guess from a community perspective, I'm concerned about on one side we've got our greener places policy, we've got the RMS missing in action, and we're about to take out more trees along Moore Park. It's just an example of where we're losing trees around the city. We have a biodiversity offset scheme that doesn't seem to be working, and on top of that we have it at the RMS who are proposing just to replace 1 tree for 1 tree. Where do we go wrong and why the RMS here?
I'm not sure these four can answer the question about why aren't RMS here, but perhaps on the more general issues you raised, open that up.
If I could start, I think the prospect of the document movement and place actually does start addressing that. Okay, that's a transport initiative, but irrespective of that, it will be a document that will have a life and need to be referred to by our colleagues in RMS. The detail of what you spoke about, the trees along Moore Park there, my understanding was that they were replacing 8 trees for every 1. And
The RMS
is the one-for-one upgrade for the alien cost?
I'm not across it.
This is something the city's very concerned about. More Anzac Parade, Allison Road, Daisy Avenue, right through McAvoy Road, which are all feeders to WestConnex. And the light rail's been blamed for some of the trees being removed when it's actually the RMS who've removed some of the trees. And who's putting them back? And who's putting them back where? It might be 8 trees, but they might be completely somewhere else in Centennial Park. They're not actually, for instance, along Allison Road, and you're knocking down 100-year-old trees and putting back a sapling, perhaps, of a different species that's got a fragile trunk. I think RMS need to be here. They do certainly fund cycleways, as we've heard, but you're getting lots of $5-10 million, whereas an intersection upgrade, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And so I think that there's an enormous imbalance in RMS's funding, and there's also, I think, a rapaciousness at the moment. We're actually seeing a return to the 1960s motorways, which is absolutely crazy. No intelligent city globally is doing such a folly as is commonplace across Australian cities today. It's incomprehensible. And we don't have green bans today. We've got to fight it ourselves with our hands, with our minds, with our voices politically. And so I'd encourage you all from the City of Sydney to fight this motorway mania, which is the biggest threat to Sydney today.
So I'm here representing Transport for New South Wales. RMS is part of the transport cluster, so I'm representing RMS, if you would like. What I will say is that with the introduction of movement in place as a policy for government in the coming weeks, with the adoption of future transport, RMS is beholden to implement that policy, and we've already started working with RMS on implementing movement in place across the state road network. What we need to do with the planning cluster, and we've started working with the government architect on this, is to better define place. How do we value places in our community, and how do we value that against how we value movement at the moment, which is probably a bit overrated. So that's a journey we all need to go on in the coming years as we really value and quantify place.
Can you take them back to your people? That problem from Alexandria to Moore Park, and the fact that they're taking those trees out, or they're going to jeopardise the trees on Daisy Avenue, because the urban carbon deficit that you're going to lose there is enormous.
Okay, well, thanks. So, did someone else want to comment? Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to comment that putting aside the motorways, which is an issue, the other bigger issue is that as we are creating good places, the approach that we're taking to the sorts of streets that we want to be creating, we're basically taking the language of motorways and we're effectively compressing it into these places, which is why our bike lanes appear over-engineered compared to Europe and South America, and I think on and on it goes. So I think whilst on one level there's the bigger battles to be had over the motorways, the advocacy that we need to do around the smaller details that count every day on the types of places that we're creating at the moment is kind of just slipping through, and we need to reframe that discussion as well and to say that there are other models and we don't need to be so engineered in how we're bringing new forms of mobility into our cities. Otherwise the irony will be there's still no there. I'll be on a bike lane and I won't want to get off it because the place is still too utilitarian and doesn't lift the spirit.
Yeah, I don't put a great deal of, I agree completely with Stephen, I don't put a great deal of weight on policies when you've got projects going on across Sydney which are completely counter to such policies. The proof's in the pudding, it's not in a document, it's what's built on the ground. So I would ask, for instance, for transport, why is there one metro stop between Central and Sydenham? What other city in the world is building an inner city metro with one stop in 7 kilometres? Why do we have a light rail system which is got so much concrete when in Europe you see grass tracks when they go through parkland? Why aren't there more stops at Carlingford on the light rail conversion? So I think there's a real problem of over-engineering, and I think it's endemic, and actually I think we need to get design into the objects, not dumb code compliance, concrete code compliance.
Gentleman at the back, and then you'll be next, and maybe the last. We'll see how we go.
Thanks. David Bennett from Shaping Suburbia. I'm interested in appropriate metrics. What does the panel think are the missing gaps that we need to convey the story, the wins that we all know, that health in the built environment is good for people. We talked about forecast mortality from type 2 diabetes, whatever it is. And secondly, is there any thinking, particularly for a transport representative on the panel, about measuring mobility, particularly for something like the RMS, who still measure vehicle movements on a roadway? If we talk about mobility, then it's blind to whichever way it would be and would therefore favour things which are better space users of our city. So which metrics are appropriate?
Some quick answers, and then we'll try and take one more question.
I'll take the second question to me. It's a bit unpopular today. So as part of Movement in Place, we've developed multimodal indicators that look in the movement of people. So we look at the pedestrian comfort level, and we're going to work with the City of Sydney on that. We look at accessibility, DDA compliance. We look at crossing opportunities. We also look at movement of people along the corridor, and that includes public transport as well as vehicles itself. So the way we're thinking about street environments is very much changing. And yes, it is a bit of a journey, but we're looking at the broader sense, cycling opportunities. On our busier corridors, we might need to use physical separation, but on the quieter local streets, we prefer to have nothing, so it's about shared environment. So we have got multimodal indicators that we're looking at beyond vehicles, it's people movement. It's also indicators about place, what makes a good place. And it's about environment, it's about all sorts of other things. So we are changing.
I think for me it's the place metrics which form the underlying DNA of a city and allow it to evolve or not over time. And it's really the intersection density, the block density, how walkable is it, it's the diversity of lot types, and it's also the frontage density. And I guess, when we look at somewhere like Walleye Creek and Potts Point, they're almost of a similar density, and someone said, well, 100 years from now, Walleye Creek will be a Potts Point. Well, it won't. And the reason is that if you say take the frontage density of Walleye Creek and Potts Point over 3 hectares of land, you stretch out Walleye Creek, the ground floor frontages only go for 1 kilometre. In Potts Point, because of the fine grain pattern of blocks, that frontage density stretches out for 4 kilometres. So put simply, Walleye Creek can never evolve to have the experiences and the activities and the intensity of uses over time, which we aspire towards in Potts Point. And I think that's where we need to shift the density debate. The real thing is the urbanity, and it's the experiences and activities that we're trying to achieve, and we're focusing too much on the density aspect and not the other metrics.
Last question,
Hi, I'm Nicola Groscott from the Cancer Institute New South Wales. I think this might be a good, maybe final question to end on, but so I'm here from a health perspective, and it's great to hear all of the landscape architects, urban planners and people from the built environment talking about how they realise the impacts of their work on health. And I just wanted to find out from your perspective, from that urban planning perspective, how can the health sector and the planning sector really improve conversations, improve engagement? Is it about the language that the two sectors are using that needs to be improved? How can we harness our conversations with each other to make that even a better collaboration?
I'm going to give you, it will be the final question, so I'll give each of you a chance to have a go at that. And if you want to chuck something else in that you're desperate to say, do, but make it quick.
Well, we're all about healthy environments, and the best way to achieve those is by having environments that people aspire to and represent who and what they are. So it's not only physical activity, it's as much about mental health. I wasn't here earlier, but I think the mental health issue is equal in this conversation. It's imperative that we all advocate together for better outcomes. We can do the physical work and the design work and the planning work, but you need the metrics about better outcomes, and that comes from the health professionals that understand that best. So to work together would be, I think, a critical move. And we are, I know, but I think we should do so more.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I think it's just the recognition that physical design affects behaviour and by default health, and together to start to publish the papers and the research around the metrics and the new evidence base that we need to shift change more quickly, because right now we're looking at building a new city called the Airport City, where every intersection still has a curb radius designed for the vehicle rather than the pedestrian, and which by default will reduce the number of people walking. We have 3,000 intersections in the inner city that prove other models exist. We need that change tomorrow, not 50 years from now, because it will be too late.
To follow. So our biggest constraint within transport and government generally is our business cases and approval of our business cases. The way we value the benefits of projects is based on travel time savings and road safety benefits. We don't really value place, we don't value health benefits and some of those broader benefits that we've spoken about in the same way. If we were to introduce those into our business cases, then we would get a totally different outcome. So it's the way Treasury and government, and not just in New South Wales, but across the world and certainly in Australia, look at the way we benefit, not just movement, but place and the broader benefits that will get us far better outcomes in the future.
Our health data project on that about 5 years ago, there was a report we commissioned about 5 years ago looking at costing things, including health benefits and costings of transport use.
Yeah, I think that last point's a really key one, and it depends what your inputs are. And I'd certainly be arguing against a sort of a linear thing from sort of a research policy rule. And so one of the key ones is obviously bicycle helmets, and that's a big health topic, and we've had lots of discussions about, well, which one's actually safer, the cumulative benefits to society versus the head injury. And so I think the business case, that model, or Off-Roads, all of these things which are sort of abstract rules which are then laid with such a heavy hand over the city, is really the wrong way to go. And so I'd like to think of design intelligence as being key. And of course, if we're talking about making cities, we've got the benefit of 10,000 years of human experience. Every continent, every culture in the history of civilization has built cities. And so they're all about socialisation, they're all about place, they're all about commerce, they're all about environment. So I think we need to bring a much more intelligent urban culture to bear, put the rules in the back pocket, and actually all be far more engaged, not in silos, but holistically with the city.